When you picture ancient Athens, we tend to think in really simple terms. You've got your powerful citizens, and then you've got everyone else. But what if that picture is just completely wrong? Today, we're going to climb the real and surprisingly complex social ladder of classical Athens. And what we find might just change how you see it all.
Right, so the story we usually get is the simple binary. You are either a free citizen with all the rights and privileges, or you are a slave with absolutely none. But was Athenian society really that black and white? Was that actually the only choice people had? Well, the answer, it turns out, is a huge no. The great historian Moses Finley gave us a much, much better way to look at all this. He argued that instead of some simple divide, we should see Athenian society as a spectrum of statuses. Think of it like a sliding scale, with all these different shades of gray between the total darkness of slavery and the bright light of full citizenship. This idea of a spectrum, well, it's the key to understanding how Athens actually worked.
Okay, so to really get a handle on this spectrum, we have to start at the absolute bottom. And that's where we find the chattel slave. This group was quite literally the foundation of the whole Athenian economy. Their status wasn't just low, it was a state of being that was completely redefined by law. Nothing, and I mean nothing, captures the legal status of a chattel slave more brutally than Aristotle's famous definition: animate property, a tool with a soul. I mean, just let that sink in. This wasn't just some philosophical thought experiment. It was the cold, hard legal reality. A person could be bought, sold, rented out, or even left in a will, just like a table or a farm animal.
The sociologist Orlando Patterson came up with a term for this experience: social death. And it's such a powerful concept. It means you are systematically ripped away from everything you know: your home, your family, your community, even your own name and identity. You're basically made into a non-person, a permanent stranger with no past that's recognized and no future that's your own.
So what did social death actually look like day to day? Well, it meant you had zero right to own anything. Your work, your body, it all belongs to your master, who could beat you without any legal consequence. Your marriage wasn't really a marriage, and your kids weren't legally yours. In the eyes of the law, you were basically invisible. This was the baseline, the absolute bottom of the ladder.
But just when we've established this incredibly grim reality, the Athenian social ladder throws us a massive curveball. Because it turns out, not all slaves fit this model of being socially dead. There was this paradox right at the heart of the system: a whole category of slaves who lived lives that seemed to completely defy everything we've just talked about.
So let me just ask you this. What if a person who is legally defined as animate property could also be your banker, managing huge amounts of money? What if a slave could own a cargo ship and sail around conducting international trade, or run a massive business? It sounds totally impossible, right? But in Athens, it was real. Just look at this contrast. It shows the two extremes of what it meant to be a slave. On one side, you've got the chattel slave stuck in the silver mines, where their life is just pure, brutal labor. But on the other, you have this privileged slave who operates with a shocking amount of freedom. They often lived on their own, ran their own businesses, and this is the big one, they had a real shot at saving up enough money to buy their own freedom. Now, the system that made all this possible was called the apophora. The easiest way to think of it is like a franchise fee. The slave would go run their business, and instead of giving all the profits to their master, they just paid a fixed, regular amount. Any money they made on top of that fee, well, that was theirs to keep. This one little arrangement changed everything. And listen, this wasn't just some theory. Let me introduce you to Pashan. This guy started out as a slave working in a bank, but he was so good at it, he didn't just earn his freedom, he eventually took over the entire bank himself, becoming one of the richest and most powerful financiers in all of Athens, a former slave. To give you some perspective on his success, at one point, Pashan had 50 talents loaned out from his own personal funds. Now, 50 talents, what does that even mean? Well, a single talent was enough cash to pay an entire warship crew. That's 200 men for a whole month. So we're talking about a staggering fortune, all built by a man who started life as someone else's property. And Pasonian wasn't just some one-off fluke. Take another guy, Lampus. Our sources call him a slave, but they also call him the naukaleros, which means the owner and the captain of his own merchant ship. I mean, here's a guy who is legally a slave, but he's out there conducting international trade and running his own shipping business. It's wild. So, what did the Athenian elite think about all this? Well, they weren't all thrilled, let me tell you. This quote from some anonymous critic we call the old oligarch is so revealing. He's complaining that to make money off these guys, to collect that apophora, masters have to become slaves to the slaves. You can almost feel the anxiety in his words. The lines between slave and free were getting way too blurry for his comfort. So here's the crucial point. These privileged slaves weren't just some weird exception to the rule. They were a key part of that spectrum of status we talked about. Their existence created actual pathways for people to move up in society, which completely blows up the idea that slavery was this permanent, inescapable trap. There was a ladder, and you better believe some people were climbing it.
You can actually map out the potential journey. You could start at the bottom as chattel, as animate property. But with some skill, or maybe just luck, you might become a privileged slave, paying your apophora and stacking your own cash. The next rung on the ladder was manumission, literally buying your own freedom. And for a tiny, tiny few, like Pashian, people who became so rich and useful that the state couldn't ignore them, even citizenship was on the table.
And it gets even more complicated. There were also public slaves, the demosioi, who weren't owned by a person, but by the city of Athens itself. These weren't miners or farmhands. They were more like a civil service. They worked as assistants to magistrates, they were the city's police force, and they kept all the official records. Their status was a world away from a private chattel slave.
And just to see how privileged a public slave could be, look at this guy, Pitolakos. The sources say he's a public slave, but he lived in his own house. He was known to have plenty of money, and, get this, he used that money to support a male citizen as his lover. A slave in a position of economic power over a citizen. I mean, that is the spectrum of status in a nutshell.
Okay, so why does digging into all these messy details of an ancient social ladder actually matter to us today? Well, because it reveals this timeless tension, this gap between the simple stories a society tells about itself and the much, much more complicated reality of how people actually live.
At the end of the day, that clean, simple idea of slave versus free was an ideology. It was a useful story that helped citizens define themselves and protect their own exclusive privileges. But that simple story was hiding the truth, a messy, fluid, and often paradoxical reality where a slave could be rich and a master could find himself, in a weird way, a slave to his slave.
And that really leaves us with one final thought. The Athenians lived with this massive gap between their official civic ideology and their actual social reality. So the question for us is, how much does that exact same kind of gap, the one between the simple stories we tell about equality and status and freedom, and the complex lived realities of our own society, how much does that gap shape the world that we live in today?